Hello, greetings everyone. Tonight we're going to be discussing, amongst other things, Boris Johnson and the government, who actually is in charge, a little bit about the Director General of Borders, good old Meghan and Harry, and something of Nigel Farage at the end, our mutual friend. But first of all, let's introduce the panelists tonight. First of all, Daniel Emmerson, who is been doing a lot of I think you describe him as rants, don't you, Dan? But he's doing quite a bit of commentary of late. So, Dan, welcome to your, I think, first panel with us, and of course, regular panelist, guest, raconteur, man of many parts, Roger Helmer. Roger, welcome again.
Thanks very much, Bill. Great to be here.
Right, without further ado, then, let's crack on with tonight's subjects because we've got some juicy ones. Now, most people might assume that this country is run by Boris Johnson, his cabinet, elected people, and generally, the people who come up for in front of the television and our votes from time to time. But the question that we need to address tonight, and I'm going to lead off with Dan on this, is that true, do we think? Who actually runs this country?
Well, I think one of the, if you're a big fan of Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, you couldn't help but think very, very funny series in the late 80s and or mid 80s to late 80s, and we're now 20, 30 years later, and we've seen a conservative centre right wing government pushing, and I'm going to say this, I would say the last 11 years, not just the Boris's government, Theresa May's and David Cameron's before that, pushing for a far left-wing agenda. Now, when I say pushing it, we've seen politicised policing, we've seen the tearing down of our statues, we've seen our institutions, what would have been known as 20, 30 years ago, are British institutions, all go woke, for want of a better way of putting it. Now, I would say for the last couple of months, the question that's just hit me is it this Boris Johnson and his cabinet, or is this something else? I think it's something else. Let me explain. I believe that the civil service are not working as they should be with our government. Now, what evidence do I have of that? We all know that I can't remember exactly, so 6 months to a year ago, when Sajid Javid was the Home Secretary, it was reported in a lot of the mainstream media papers that he'd requested a report on the grooming gangs. I don't know if you remember that. And he was refused by Sir Philip Ruttman. Now, when Pretty took over, I think it was reported that the same situation arose. So Pretty wanted to see the report pretty much, before she even took her coat off in the Home Office. And again, she was refused. It didn't really hit me at the time, but now I'm thinking, well, who are they to refuse a democratically elected member of Parliament that has been put into a position of Home Secretary? I believe the civil service are there to enact government policy. Yes, they help shape it, but I just look at all the logical things that we've seen just since Brexit. Look what's happened just since Brexit. We may as well have voted in Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, well, I think that's the thought that many of us had. But Roger, just to pick up on what Dan's started here, a far left Conservative government having rings run round it by an out of control bunch of Sir Humphreys in the civil service who are denying elected representatives the reports, documentation, information they require. Does that appear to you to be how the situation's working out? And if it is, what should be done about it?
Well, I think Dan is absolutely right. Funnily enough, I watched an old episode of Yes Minister last night, and it reminded me not only of the programme, which was great and extremely funny, but of course it reminded me of what's going on at the moment. And it is clearer and clearer that the civil service as a whole is tending towards a woke direction. And when the government wants to do something different, they immediately meet resistance. And the idea that a civil servant can refuse to hand over a report to a minister, I mean, I'm frankly shocked by that. I knew there were all sorts of shenanigans going on. I didn't know it was that bad, and that is horrifying. I mean, if ministers can't get reports, especially reports that have already been produced and are available and are sitting on the shelf, why on earth do we do reports? If anything, though, I would broaden the criticism. I think it is true that the civil service is running rings around ministers. I would also say that right through the pandemic, we've also seen the scientific establishment, and especially SAGE and the subcommittees of SAGE, doing exactly the same things. And here, I think the onus is really, the blame is really with the Prime Minister and politicians generally. And I can understand how easy it is. You don't want to be blamed as a politician. And a great cop-out is to say, oh, well, we just followed the science. The problem with that, of course, is that a lot of what they're following is not science, strictly speaking. It is projections. It is guesses. And the more and more we follow these things, the more we realize they're wrong. Neil Ferguson seems to spend half his time explaining why the predictions that he made last year or last month or today, even 10 days ago, why those predictions are so wildly out. So for the government or the Prime Minister to say, well, we were just following the science, they ought to use their critical facilities. And in particular, it is not their job to follow any one particular, I will say, lobby group, because the SAGE is clearly a lobby group. There are scientific advisors, yes, of course, and they should be listened to, of course. But there are also public health issues. We've heard a bit about the damage in other areas of public health, cancer, heart disease, mental health, all those things that have been let go while we've been devoting all our resources to COVID. There are huge economic issues. And I absolutely reject this idea that it's a choice between lives and money. Of course it isn't. Lives depend on the economy. The economy funds the health service. It funds it funds all the public services we depend on. So if we're going to say, well, we'll cure COVID but destroy the economy, lives will be lost. Businesses will be lost. Livelihoods will be lost right, left, and centre. So it is the job of a politician, yes, to take the scientific advice, but also to listen carefully and think of the implications from other angles of following that advice. And if I may just add one other point, one other, not group, but person that I would implicate in undue influence on government policy, it is, of course, Mrs. Johnson. It is the famous Carrie. And I'm sure that quite a number of the sort of things that Boris is more and more committed to are actually at the instigation of Carrie, not at the instigation of the government or of ministers, least of all of the Conservative Party or the general public. So we're following a lot of the things that she wants to do, when in my view, we absolutely should not.
Well, chaps, you've painted, both of you, a very believable and plausible picture. But are we to really believe, truly believe, that our elected politicians, the cream of Eton, the business generals, the international bankers, all of these people who have gone into placed roles within our government, they're such babes in the wood, innocents lost in amongst such cutthroat, tough guys, civil servants and medical experts, although some of the people on SAGE aren't anything to do with medical and more to do with behavioural science. But we're really to believe, are we, Dan, that these guys aren't really, we shouldn't be perhaps too hard on them, because they're just being led by the nose. And what poor old little Boris, little curly boy with his blonde hair, what a shame for him. These naughty, nasty civil servants are running the roost. Is that really what we're all saying here?
Well, I think you have to understand that let's take the current cabinet as a perfect example. Yeah, there isn't a working class person amongst them. Yeah, they're all spoon fed, all silver spooned, all little rich kids. Yeah, so the bubble that they live in is exactly the same bubble that they're in government. Yeah, they're pampered, they're nursed, and I know for certain that certain ministers are managed with regards to the information that they receive from their department. Anyone wants to take me to court on that, fill your boots. But they are managed. I've sat in meetings when I worked for the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and I was assigned to the EU exit team within a couple of weeks because my particular skill set shone. So you know, we're in the build up to leaving the European Union, and as a Brexiteer myself, it was a fantastic opportunity. Nothing was put in place. You know, there was nothing. This was 3 years after we voted to leave. I sat in a meeting and I was told we manage the information that goes up the chain. That's what was said to me. But going back to the original, but if you look at the current cabinet, would they even recognise that they're being handled? No.
Well, Priti Patel isn't one of these pampered people you speak about. She's roundly mocked for being working class.
But she's gagged, isn't she? Yeah. So I talked with Andrew Bridgen the other day, who knows Priti Patel quite well, and he told me that she ordered these boats to you know, for more boats to police the channel. However, her intention doesn't match what they are actually doing. They are now a taxpayer-funded taxi service. Yeah, they're ferrying over illegal immigrants across the channel with the help of the French Navy. So for me, if you look at this cabinet, it's a bunch of there's no personalities in there. There's no energy. Do you know what I mean? We all thought that was Boris, but it turns out that it isn't.
No, he's an empty shell. But Roger, what Dan's portraying here, and of course, no reason to doubt it. So let's ride with it. Let's go with what Dan's saying. It promotes a picture where the civil service and others are running the country, and they're running it in a way which is at the very least woke. Quite well, in effect, it's rather left wing to say the very least. What do you think the motivation for that could be? I mean, why would our civil service have a political inclination to take this country down a sort of, well, in my estimation, a Corbynite extreme left route? Why could that be? What's going on?
Well, as Shakespeare said, there is a tide in the affairs of men, and sometimes particular sets of attitudes become very popular until people realize that they don't work. And I think that is probably what has happened. There is so much agitation, the march of the socialists and Marxists through the institutions, through the universities, and so on, and through the media particularly, has reached alarming proportions.
Would you put common purpose in that into there? The
yes,
involvement?
Yes.
Hit the nail on the head.
The World Economic Forum and all these guys. There is so much pressure. And take my hobby horse, the IPCC, the Climate Change Committee. One of their guys actually said it's no longer about climate. It's no longer about the environment. It's about redistributing wealth around the world. But I think there's another aspect of it here. I don't think people like Boris, and indeed the other ministers, I don't think they're stupid. And if they're having information withheld, I'm surprised they don't assert themselves more, but I can't believe they're not aware of it. But I tell you the parallel I would make. They say the stock market runs on a tension between greed and fear. Well, I think in a way government runs on a tension between greed, at least if not for money, for support and votes and popularity on the one hand, and fear of being blamed on the other hand. And I'm sure a lot of what drives Boris and his colleagues to do what they're told by Sage, for example, is a feeling that, well, if we do what Sage told us, it can't be our fault, we can blame them. Whereas, of course, what they should be doing is actually forming their own judgment and pursuing it. And if the civil servants don't want to support that, we'll find some new civil servants. It's as simple as that.
So Dan, Roger says that basic government is run by greed and fear, and that Boris and co aren't stupid, and they know what's happening. If that's the case, what is the motivation? We mentioned common purpose, but we have this unelected bureaucracy pushing elected members down a certain route, which they must know that they're being pushed in this route. They must understand what's happening. They even with my low contempt for these people, know that they're not that stupid. So what do you put this down to?
I think you give them far too much credit, both you and Roger, to be honest. Yeah. So when what does Sajid Javid know about health? Yeah. What does Sajid Javid know anything about running the NHS and the intricacies of the the multiple moving parts? Yes, a granular level he doesn't need to know, but a minister, a Secretary of State, is only as good as the information that is passed to them. It's very much like a general in the middle of a war. Yeah, the general tends to be 100,000, maybe on a different continent to where the battle is. The general is only as good as the information that is passed to him from the guys on the ground. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, what is the motivation behind it? I think it's we know better than the plebs. That's the mentality. The civil service oozes with classism. Yeah, that absolutely oozes with it, and they think they know better. Yeah, this cabinet, that there aren't any of them that really have a grasp on the portfolios to which they, to which at the moment that they look after. So I know, I can't talk about what I'm going through at the moment, but I know it happens. And as in a few months' time, I'll be able to divulge in granular detail. But I know it's happening. Yeah, the cabinet is only as good as its SPADs. Yeah, the SPADs are only as good as the information that is fed into them by their departments. Yeah, and I know that they manage the information that they get. When Boris, I was sat in a civil service building surrounded by deputy directors and level sixes. Yeah. And when Boris, the day after Boris won the general election, the word CUNT was used by a lady I actually like, but she didn't like the Tories, in an open plan office of probably about 50 to 60 people, all sat there staring at her, to which I was one of them. Yes, it's isolated. It's the only time that I saw it, but I know that from first-hand experience, and that they can't stand this government. They can't stand them.
So, before we get on to something else to do with this government, which I know you're bursting to do, Roger, but I want to give you the opportunity now to, if you like, defend Boris Johnson, the government, because Dan thinks that we're giving them too much credit. So I'll give you the chance to rebut this. This pampered bunch of toffs who are just used to nanny looking after them, they've got no clue about life whatsoever, are being led by the nose, and Boris Johnson's being led by another part of his anatomy, by his wife, and it's all complete chaos because they are utterly stupid and hopeless, and they are being led by the civil servants. Roger Helmer.
Apologies, Roger. Just before you start, I just want to make it clear: Boris Johnson is not thick. I mean, from what I've read of him, he's fluent in 7 different languages. I'm talking about government. Yeah, I'm talking
education doesn't make intelligence.
Exactly that.
Yeah, no, but anyway, I'm trying to frame it in a controversial way, Dan, so that Roger can come back with something spicy. Don't deflate my bubble here. I'm trying to get Roger all worked up. So anyway, Roger Helmer, defend our elected government.
Well, it's a fairly difficult thing to do, and I would only vote Conservative these days because The one point where I disagree with Dan's introductory remarks is I think if we'd elected Jeremy Corbyn, we'd have got more of the same but worse. And I think, therefore, Boris, my defence of Boris is the ain't so bad as Jeremy Corbyn would have been or Keir Starmer would be. But no, I think I've got questions I'd like to put to him. I mean, think back to Margaret Thatcher. Do you think Margaret Thatcher, I know she read things till 4 o'clock in the morning to be briefed for the next day, but do you think she would just have accepted what was in the red box and left it at that? Of course she wouldn't. I mean, on a much smaller scale, I've run businesses and I have managers coming to me and presenting points of view and recommendations and so on and so on. You don't just accept what they say. You should be asking questions, asking difficult questions, putting the guy on the spot. Does it really work like that? How can you say so and so? Haven't you read an article that appeared in the paper this morning that says something entirely different, or whatever it happens to be? So they ought to be challenging at least the information they're being given. They ought to be applying their common sense to it. And my fear is they're not. And I come back to the point I made earlier. It's this tension between fear and the desire for popularity. We're dealing with people's lives here. We're dealing with arguably 130,000 deaths, so I don't think they were all caused by COVID. But that is what is going to stick. That is what is going to be remembered. Boris is going to be found guilty of failing to keep the numbers down. I don't think it was entirely his responsibility. There are all sorts of factors that produce the result that we've seen. But he is afraid of that. He's afraid of coming to a general election where he's the man who lets people die of COVID. And therefore he is scared, and he thinks the best way out is to listen to Sage. I think he's wrong. I think he started out as a libertarian, and I'd like to see him behaving a bit like a libertarian.
Well, yeah, I think he needs to remember what that word means. But before we move on to something related but slightly different,
I just want to say Margaret Thatcher had balls. Boris doesn't.
I think perhaps she might have disagreed with that definition. But anyway, before we move on, you both put very sane and reasoned ideas forward. Let me confront you both with another idea. What if the government knows full well what it's doing in collusion and cahoots with the civil service and SAGE and the World Economic Forum and others, and everything that has been going on for the last 18 months is purely driven by driving us into the cashless society, driving us into identity cards, driving us into a world where individual freedom and liberty is a thing of the past, and ultimately a Chinese-style system with social credits, which, if it does seem that far-fetched, well, the reports are now that the Bank of England is looking at its own GB cryptocurrency, and the ID cards are being worked on now. I put it to you, and I'll start with Dan, I put it to you that what was once a conspiracy theory is now just reading the news.
So for me, my gut feeling on what I've learned in the last 3 years working with various civil service departments is the civil service would love it. I can't see. I just can't see the grassroots of the Conservative Party putting up with its leadership wanting vaccine passports and digital. I can't see it. From the Tories, I've spoken to my local Tory association, and they're one of the largest in Britain. And the general feeling back from that is no chance. And I get that feeling of every Tory I speak to. I've spoken to 3 MPs this week, all of them flat out. I didn't even get to the end of the sentence. Never going to happen. But I think it's something that the civil service would relish and welcome.
So, Roger, is what I said to Dan a load of internet-generated gibberish and madness? And even if it wasn't, the grassroots of the Tory party, and you were a Conservative, I'm sorry to bring up previous mistakes in our lives, but you were a Conservative for many years. Do you think that even if it is true, the grassroots of the Tory party will rise up and save us from tyranny.
I certainly think that the grassroots of the Tory party do not want this woke agenda, and they do not want an awful lot of what the government is doing. And that is one of the dangers. If you think about, I'm thinking of a particular Conservative MP on my patch, and I know him a bit, Peter Bone, absolutely admirable guy. And he has already said that if the Tory party conference this October requires a vaccine passport, then he will not attend as a point of principle. And I commend him and admire him for that. No, I think there will be huge resistance. Let me say, I do not believe that COVID is something that has been invented or actually applied to the world as a political power play. I don't believe it exists merely to make money for pharmaceutical companies. I also don't believe all the death statistics, because I believe that many of them are entirely misplaced and people were dying from other things which were attributed to COVID. I do think, however, governments, perhaps almost unconsciously, are relishing the control they have over the people. They're astonished, and this is not my theory, I mean, it's been published and commented on. They're astonished that the British people, who we all thought were committed to the principle of freedom, actually quietly went away, and when they were told to self-isolate and they were told to lock down, and they did what they were told. And even more than that, some of them apparently, if you believe the pollsters, actually would rather, a majority of them would actually rather stay locked down than be freed. I was in the supermarket today, and I was horrified by how many customers were still wearing masks.
But Roger, if somebody's paying 80% of your wages and you can sit at home and watch daytime telly all day, it's very attractive, isn't it?
Oh, it certainly is, yes. And that we've introduced all sorts of perverse incentives. And the worry that I have, certainly there are people around the place, including the World Economic Forum, who are openly saying, right, we've demonstrated that when there's an emergency like COVID, we can take drastic measures, we can stop people flying, we can stop people traveling, we can get them to stay home, we can do all those things. Now we're facing a climate emergency, we have to do the same. We have to cut back. You may not have a petrol-driven car, you may not fly abroad on your holiday, and if necessary, we'll get people to sit at home for 6 months of the year if that's what it takes. That is
Roger, you've hit the metaphorical nail right on the box. That's a very nice. That's why I enjoy. One of the many reasons I enjoy being doing these programs with you. You segue into things for me so nicely, because boggle-eyed loons like me happen to think that whilst COVID exists, even though the CDC in America has had said that they need to change the testing mechanism because they can't tell the difference between that and flu, which might explain where flu went last year. Who knows? I'm not a doctor and not an expert. So as they all say, oh, where's your doctorate from? You can't comment on these things. But many of us would suggest, and I'm going to throw this your way, Dan, so be ready for this, because this is the nub of my conspiracy theory. Many of us suggest that this whole thing is leading us into a completely green obsessed climate change fantasy world, whereas Roger quite rightly says already we've been told we can't travel, we're getting used to lockdowns, maybe once a year we'll have to have a lockdown to save the planet, and all of this Greta Thunberg style insanity which has absolutely infected the leaders all around the world. I believe that that's where we're heading, and that's the motivation. That's what's driving SAGE, the World Economic Forum, the civil service, because they believe this crap. And I think that's where we're heading, and I think that's what this is all about. Am I wrong?
Well, I think COVID-19 is real. Of course, it's real. Is it as bad as it's being pushed out? No, we knew that after the first lockdown, when every anybody that unfortunately died for whatever reason, it was attributed to COVID-19. But I do think there's an opportunity now for the Western world to try and reset itself after country after country after country running their economies into the dust.
A great reset, you could say, Dan. Is it a great reset?
Exactly. Yeah. So we had Godfrey Bloom on, didn't we, a couple of months ago, and he mentioned, when Rishi Sunak stands up and says, we're currently running at 100% of GDP, he's actually lying. It's more like 304% of GDP, because what they don't include is the public sector pensions. And if you're a private sector company, you'd go to prison for it. But anyway, it is what it is. So again, all of these reasons, all of these speculations, all tinfoil hat. The one thing we can agree on, that there is something not right with this. It's not what they're telling us. Yeah. Boris Johnson moves his goalposts as easily as a flag blows in the wind. That's the problem with it. It's the change in direction on policies. We're not having vaccine passports. We are having vaccine passports. So who knows? Only time will tell us what the overall agenda really is.
It's almost like someone's changing his instructions. But Roger, if all this is about a green agenda, which you so neatly segued us into before, and it helps us to get to net zero, which after all is the stated policy, and I'm sure we're all behind because it's a great idea. Surely that's a good thing. And in a week where Boris has had to admit that there are some financial implications and difficulties with achieving this wonderful net zero that we all aspire to, maybe we should get on board with this, because after all, we are trying to save the planet, aren't we?
Yes, of course we are. The first point I would make, and let me cover this very briefly, because it's a subject you can argue about for hours and hours, but my position, just very briefly, is I do not believe that human activity is the only factor, or even a major factor, in the control of the climate. The climate has changed on a more or less cyclical basis since the dawn of time. The Earth's been here for 4.5 billion years, and the climate has always changed. There have been times when there have been tropical oceans over bits of Britain, and there have been times when there have been a mile of ice over Helsinki. So the climate always changes. I don't believe that CO2 is a major factor, and although they're a minority, there are many scientists who would agree with me. The second thing is, I don't think the action we are taking will have the effect that is desired. California, for example, and Germany, for example, have been very upfront on switching to renewable energy. The bizarre thing is they don't seem to have reduced emissions, partly because they've all chosen to close down their nuclear power stations. But I think the really exciting development is a shift in public attitudes. Do you remember the French Gilets jaunes? That was a protest originally specifically against an eco-tax on fuel. Now, if you go out and do research and ask people in the street, should we be doing something about climate change? Should we save the planet? Of course, they will say yes. And then you say, well, do you want to spend an extra £2,000 on your Mediterranean holiday? Or do you want to spend an extra £10,000 on your car? Or do you want to spend £40,000 or £50,000 putting in a heat pump and rebuilding your house, in effect, to make the heat pump work? All of a sudden they say, oh, no. They say, you say, who should do it? And they say, well, the government should do it. Well, the government can't, because the only money the government has is our money. And the cost of it is incredible. And the idea that we can actually create new green jobs and more investment and more economic success by wasting money on this absurd proposition is just crazy. But what I'm really encouraged by, and this is news of the last couple of weeks, really, that Boris, having told us we're all going to have to get rid of our gas boilers, and I have an oil boiler, I assume that's going to come in too, and we've got to replace it with heat pumps. He was going to do that by 2035, and it now looks like 2040.
And hydrogen boilers as well.
Yeah, he's quietly backing off. I think the public resistance will get to the point where he just can't do it. It's impossible to do in a democratic country, which is why it looks as though governments are trying to seize more power and do away with democracy. A very good piece by Ambrose in today's Telegraph about vaccine passports pointing out that the use of vaccine passports, especially in Europe, who are in worse case than we are in Britain over this, vaccine passports are wholly totalitarian. They're dividing society. They're saying you cannot go into a restaurant or a theatre or a football match. You cannot travel. You cannot do this. You cannot do that unless you have the vaccine passport. And people will not tolerate that. They are out on the streets. Well, they have been in Britain, of course. It's not reported very widely, but certainly in France and the rest of Europe, people are actually up in arms about this. They will not stand for it. You cannot do it in a democratic country. And that, I think, is the most encouraging news for quite a long time.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'd much rather see people rebelling against slavery in a velvet cage than
Sorry, there's one other point I must make on that, Bill, if you'll let me. And that is that I understand the Council of Europe has actually written to governments on the continent saying that the actions they are proposing to take by discriminating against people on the grounds of health status could actually be a breach of the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, I've never been a great fan of the European Convention on Human Rights, but it is, I think, salutary that they are pointing out that the plans now in place on vaccine passports are arguably a breach of the Human Rights Act.
Well, I shall become a fan of it if that works out. I'll be all in favour. Now, we must move along. We must move along. We have a moment where I discussed earlier where we're going to have our good old mutual friend, Mr. Farage, featured. And we have a clip of video to show with Nigel in action, and then we'll talk about it after.
What the Farage? The story today that really had me choking on my cornflakes. Take a look at the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Deputy Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme, Joyce Mysua, who was speaking at the opening ceremony for the 54th session of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Here she is.
While the climate crisis, together with biodiversity loss and pollution, has indeed been underway for decades, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought this triple planetary crisis into sharp focus. The pandemic is a warning from the planet that much worse lies in store unless we change our ways.
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. The pandemic is a warning from the planet. Yes.
Well, I've seen that face many a time, and the oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. I think we've all heard that one. Regards to Nigel, by the way, he's looking very trim and fit. I think he must have a health trainer with his new TV gig. Dan, it's a warning from the planet. There's much worse to come. Mother Nature is fighting back. She's going to scourge us like the terrible infection we are. It's right, isn't it?
It's absolute madness. Who is funding these people? Who's funding the UN? I mean, I've got nothing to say. Nigel said it all. Absolutely crazy.
Roger, I'm sure you've got great sympathy for the lady there.
Well, it's extraordinary the number of things you read about in the paper. Anything that goes wrong anywhere. Too hot, too cold, flood, drought, wind, lack of wind. Whatever happens, it's the cause of it is climate change, and really weird things like the size of carrots are all down to climate change. The folly is writ large. I think it's getting to the point where it's almost becoming laughable. And I always remember the quote from the guy at the IPCC who actually said that climate action is no longer about the climate, no longer about the environment. It's actually about redistributing wealth from rich countries to poor countries. So it's part of I wouldn't say a global conspiracy, but a global plan to impose radical solutions on politics. And less is it actually really, in any real sense, about climate.
Yes, and you mentioned there about things being affected by climate change, and obviously one thing that we're often told is affected by climate change is migration of peoples, and it's going to get worse and worse. And on that note, isn't it great, Dan, that the Director General of Borders, Glyn Williams, has received a £13,000 bonus for all the good work he's done in patrolling our borders. I think he's done a great job, don't you?
Well, yeah. So let's just put some meat on the bone of it. So Glyn Williams is the Director General of Immigration and Borders. His annual salary is £145,000 a year, and the Mail Online reported this on Tuesday, that he received a £13,000 bonus for a job well done for the periods covering 2019 and 2020. Now, in 2019, of the illegal immigrants that came onto our shores that year that we know of, the number was 1,892. Last year, 2020, the number rose to 8,420 that we know of. Now, here's another question on the civil service. Now, I think that's failure. Yeah, because the number should be going down and not going up. But do the civil service have the same agenda as a vast majority of the British people when it comes to illegal immigration? Being rewarded for what is that, 5 times as worse as it was the year before?
Yeah, I mean, Roger, as a private businessman of some repute, I guess if you had a manager who was 500% worse than the year before, you'd have been delighted to give him a £13,000 bonus, wouldn't you?
Well, I feel quite sorry for him, actually. I mean, if you work it out, it's less than 5% of his salary. I think he'd be demanding a bit more, wouldn't he? But it's all very well. We can have a good laugh about a bonus for the guy who's supposed to be responsible for immigration. The question arises, what can we do? I mean, I think Priti Patel really wants to stop it, but she doesn't know how. And she is prevented by all the human rights legislation and the international agreements we've entered into, and so on. Now, I have heard people in the pub over a beer saying that, what's the border force for? What's the Navy for? We should be going out and judiciously puncturing all these damned inflatable boats and letting them sink or swim and get on with it. Now, I appreciate you can't do that. You can't just go out and take action, which is almost certain to kill some people. But there is a whole range of anti-personnel measures which are non-lethal and which could be applied. Noise, lasers, tear gas, all sorts of methods that could make life thoroughly unpleasant, and they should be told quite clearly, you may not enter our waters, get the hell out of here, get back to where you came from, because you may not pass. That is what, in my view, we should be doing. I suspect, however, it is contrary to the international conventions that we've entered into. And the only solution is to revisit those conventions and say, we have exceptional circumstances. We have to respond to those exceptional circumstances. We can take the whole thing about refugees. The refugee rules were splendid and compassionate when you were dealing with relatively modest numbers. But when you're dealing with, Dan was quoting figures for the previous years, I believe the expected figure for this year, just for channel crossings, is between 20 and 30,000. Yeah. And we have the report from Migration Watch saying that 90% of the increase in population, I think, over the last 10 years is down to immigration. We are an overcrowded country. We cannot cope with these people. And the fact that they are almost entirely male, almost entirely young, and in very large proportion, people from an extremely different cultural background with extremely different cultural values, I choose my words with care, they are doing damage to the cohesion of our society, quite apart from the costs and the impact on public services. And we should be taking emergency action to stop it.
80% young males as well.
Yeah.
Well, vulnerable children, I think you'll find, Dan, according to how they're classified.
35-year-old children, yes.
Yeah, but I think we're probably going to be very much in agreement on that. So we're into the last few minutes of what we can get through tonight. So I'd like to bring up something where I'm sure we'll all have a great degree of sympathy, and that is Meghan Markle, who, yeah, there she is, the lovely lady herself, full of charm, radiantly, full of positivity and kindness as ever. She is hoping for and expecting an apology from the royal family. for the way she's been treated. Now, Dan, I know that you're a man with a great deal of sympathy for the lady in question. So perhaps you can add your voice to the calls for some understanding and kindness from the royal family towards the blessed Meghan.
Over to you, Roger.
Uh,
I think that one of the US newspapers, International Business Times, I think it's a US paper, actually reported yesterday that Meghan was very disappointed because she was expecting an apology from the royal family. I stopped. I read the first paragraph and I just couldn't read anymore. Is it me, or does Harry look like a hostage every time you see him on camera with her? You know, like she's got some kind of gun to his back. He does not look a happy chap. Whoever their public, their PR people are, they're making a real arse of it. They're annoying the Brits. You know, they're annoying they're now annoying the Americans. It's just so I don't know what to say about him. I am starting to feel sorry for Harry, because would he? I would like to be a fly on the wall. If his brother asked him, if you knew back then what you know now, would you marry Meghan?
Well, if he were to say yes, I really would be worried about his sanity. But Roger, I think poor future President Meg, she's having a rough time of it again here, and it's not the first time we've given her some stick. So, do you have any sympathy at all for the fact that perhaps the royal family, they've been a bit hidebound, they've been a bit rigid, old-fashioned, and authoritarian, and they need to embrace new ways and get a bit more touchy-feely and understand the emotions of this poor wronged woman?
Well, if you demand that your royal family should be just like ordinary people, you end up really rather wondering why you have a royal family. I always liked, there was a satirical column in the old days in the Telegraph, which wrote about all sorts of exciting things, and they were suggesting a socialist monarchy that would exist in 50 years' time, where King Norman the Good would travel on a double-decker bus. That is not the kind of monarchy I think that we want. I will say, however, I did think that photograph you showed us of Meghan a few moments ago was absolutely charming. Doesn't she look nice? The thing is, though, she calls herself a black woman. Does that look like a black woman to you? It doesn't look like a black woman to me. I know who her parents were. We all know who her parents were. And yes, she has a mixed race mother. But she doesn't look like a black woman, so I get a little annoyed that she makes a big deal out of being black and so on. She is completely out of touch with certainly public opinion here, although she probably doesn't care. She's interested really in public opinion in the States. I think Harry is a disgrace. The monarchy is a great British national institution. He was born privileged. He had a wonderful opportunity given to so few people to be part of it and to make something of it. And he has chosen to, I was going to use a rude phrase, to dump on it.
Yes.
Perhaps that is a rude phrase. That's what he is doing. But in insulting and upsetting and attacking his family, the monarchy, he is in a way attacking all of us, because I, at least, and I think the majority of the British people, see the monarchy as representative of us.
As always, Roger.
I stand and salute the flag and stand up for the national anthem, not because I know the Queen personally and admire her, although I do admire her, but because she represents the country. And just as, one salutes the flag at the Olympics, so one salutes the monarchy in the same way. And one doesn't dump on it, especially when one is in that privileged position. And I think Harry's behaviour is beyond disgusting. I really do.
Just one last point, if I can just add to that. I come from one of the roughest council estates in London, and to listen to him tell me that I had white privilege when I was a kid, considering the family that he was born into and where he was born, it's an insult to every English and British person in this country.
Absolutely right. The man is a disgrace. I think on all of parts, I think both Roger, Dan, and I agree with that. Despite our differing views on the monarchy, which we've discussed before, and I'm sure we'll again. But we have come to the end of our allocated time of 50 minutes tonight. I hope it's been an enjoyable 50 minutes for everyone. I've certainly thoroughly enjoyed it. So I want to say a big thank you to Dan for coming and giving us the down low on many of the things that he's had to discuss tonight. So thank you for that, Dan. And Roger, as always, an absolute pleasure, sir. It's been a great joy to share the screen with you. From me, I'll just say to everyone, if you've enjoyed it, share it, click on the follow button, follow us on YouTube, get this round, because the more we share it, the more people see it, the more we get free speech. But for now, from all of us, it's thank you and good night.
Thanks, guys.